Dober dan, dobrodošli in prav lepo pozdravljeni še v imenu organizacijskega odbora Jesenske filmske šole, ki se letos odvija v bistvu prvi dan v Kinodvoru in potem še vse do nedelje v slovenski kinoteki s predavanji in filmsko retrospektivo, ki smo jih združili pod naslovom Mi gledamo film, film gleda nas. Da bi čim prej prišli k bistvu tega današnjega, po mojem, zelo zanimivega srečanja, bom preklopila v angleščino, ker imamo z nami gosta iz Anglije, iz kina Watershed v Bristolu, Tara Judah in Marka Cosgrova, whom I kindly invite to stage. So I will just quickly read and present our audience who you are, just to get to know you. So Tara Judah is a PhD candidate at the University of West England. In collaboration with Watershed and the University of Exeter, Tara's research focuses on the role of independent cinema in the age of on-demand culture. Tara is also an editor at Census of Cinema and for Movie Critics Review. Marka Cosgrova has worked in independent film exhibition for over 30 years. He is cinema curator at Watershed in Bristol, one of the UK's leading independent art house cinemas, which was awarded the European Cinemas Entrepreneur of the Year in 2010. Mark has curated and tutored film seasons on a variety of subjects, including New European cinema and independent Hollywood, and retrospectives on Claire Denis, Urli Seidel, and Fukusaku Kinji. He recently founded Cinema Rediscovered, a festival of restorations and archive film. Mark regularly works with musicians on live scores to film and on site-specific screenings. He is a visiting fellow at University of West of England. So, Tara, Mark, I kindly invite you to stage with a beautiful presentation with the name Curation and Community, the Case for Independent Cinema. So, big round of applause. Thanks.
Thank you. So Mark is going to talk a little bit about the history of Watershed, how the model for Watershed was set up and how that's changed, give a little bit of background, and then we're going to have a bit of a conversation about how that has staged and set the agenda for the role that Watershed plays in terms of cultural cinema in the UK today, and the focus on things like curation and community in building that picture. And we'll have a discussion around how that's evolved, and then we'll obviously open up after that so other people can join us as well. So should we start with the presentation part, Mark?
Yep.
You ready? Yeah.
Happy birthday, Kinodvor. Congratulations on being 100 years old. And congratulations to Mecca and Kun and the team. Here's to another 100. And I think, it's just testament to the importance of cinema. I've been here before, it was about 10 years ago, I think, and came into this cinema and said, this is a fantastic cinema. And that was my immediate response when I walked in again, was just, oh, this is a fantastic cinema. And it's the importance of these spaces that I will talk about, fundamentally believe in, and that belief has become even stronger post-COVID. In fact, I'll come on to that anyway. So yes, I've got a presentation, but I'm just going to look at I've got some notes that I'll just open this. Also, it's great to be back in Europe. So, yes, indeed. So I'm just going to say a bit about Watershed, just to give you some context. I know that Kun and Mecca know the cinema, but just so that you get a sense of where we are. And then talk through the importance of what I call as curation, culture and communities, which cinema sits at the kind of heart of. The cinema experience sits in the heart of. And as I say, this has become much more focused in my mind. It was becoming much more focused in my mind, but it became more focused in my mind during and after COVID. So, yeah. So this, I've got a little indicator here. So this is Watershed. So this here was Watershed in the 1970s, and the reason that Watershed's called Watershed is there's the water, and there is the shed. And these two things put together create Watershed. It's actually become a bit of a brand through the whole of Bristol, where things are called they're called something shed. So it's quite interesting the way in which the city development and the harbour side development has kind of embraced these sheds. The sheds were part of the Bristol, it was a big trading port. It's got a very tortuous and unfortunate history in the slave trade. So Bristol was was at the epicentre of the slave trade in the 1700s, and actually Bristol made all its money at that time on the slave trade. So it was part of the triangle of taking boats were going from Bristol to the east coast of Africa, taking slaves from Africa over to the Caribbean and the Americas, and then bringing the goods back to the UK. So it was part of that triangle, which was abolished in the sort of mid 1800s. But of course, continued for a while beyond that. But when it finished, Bristol was still a trading port, and this is how it was its main industry, and it was doing trading with, all sorts of countries. They had a big connection with Portugal, sherry, alcohol, as well as lots of foodstuffs. So what would happen is, again, the boats would go out and bring back the produce, and this produce was then stored in these sheds. They were very functional sheds. The boats would come in here, load into the sheds, and then the railway tracks would take the goods all the way across the UK. So this here is actually right in the centre of the city of Bristol. This is called the floating harbour, and in the so it's inland, which is kind of weird. So it's a bit like a canal. It was an amazing feat of engineering, but it's a bit like a canal, so that the boats would stay upright rather than when the tide went out, the boats collapsed. But what happened was that then a big industrial container port was built in the Avonmouth, which was further towards the coast, and the shipping industries and the trading industries just collapsed almost overnight. But certainly through the 50s and 60s, and like a lot of city centres in the UK, they had to, the local authorities, the municipalities, the city councils, had to sort of rethink how the use of their city centre, or whatever it was that was changing its relationship. So these sheds in the 70s were all part of a big bit of the city, which were just dilapidated. It was falling to bits. There was one, it almost happened, which was the city authority was going to take a motorway. It was going to cover this over with road and take cars so that they could drive all the way through Bristol. So you would go from north to south to the west, and a bit like Glasgow, my hometown, where you have the motorway cutting right through the city. But fortunately, they decided not to. There's a whole interesting history there in terms of city planning and development, which is in. But Watershed, in the 1980s, Watershed didn't exist. But there was some people around. I wasn't there. I'm too young. But there was people there who wanted to set up some kind of cinema arts provision that was not a traditional gallery or a traditional cinema in that sense, but which was speaking to the changing media and communication landscape at the time of the 1980s. I always find it a bit terrifying talking about this, because I was there and I remember that there was only 3 television channels in the UK. There was BBC One, BBC Two, and a commercial channel called ITV. In 1982, Channel 4 started. And at that time, there was also, Channel 4 were investing in a new model of developing filmmaking talent. So they had, rather than filmmaking just coming from the centre, i.e. London, Channel 4 was very aware of its responsibility to the nations and regions. And so they developed what was the workshop movement, which was getting filmmaking workshops across the UK. And this actually led to a whole range of really interesting independent filmmaking, that like John Acumfra, Isaac Julian, directors like that, and directors in the north of England. And then satellite communication was just beginning to happen as well. And so Watershed was actually set up as a kind of public-private partnership in a way to speak to that changing landscape. So it was set up as Britain's first media and communication centre. And it's really interesting because now, and actually through digital, I would argue that it's more in a place to realise that potential than it was back then. It was kind of visionary back then in thinking about media and communication. But the landscape was obviously going to hugely change once digital appeared. Anyway, the main at that point was to get a space, to get a venue, and always bear that in mind. And we'll talk about that when I come to COVID. Is the venue is absolutely central and important. So this was this was empty sheds, and it was they developed this. They redeveloped this. These 2 sheds here, which is this up here is how it exists today. So Watershed is actually this shed, this one, and then underneath it. Didn't want to do that. Underneath it as well. So that was. It wasn't developed in 1982 fully, as you see it up at the top. It was over a number of years that the full development of the site, and we actually didn't own the building until about 15 years ago. We bought the building 15 years ago, but it was a partnership. In 1982, it was a partnership between the local authority, the British Film Institute, the Arts Council. I think there was some sponsorship involved back in those days. But the important thing was, though, that it was the first stage of the development of this whole area of Bristol, which was the harbour side. And if you go to Bristol now, I should actually have had a picture of what it's like now. But you can get a sense of it up here. There's this boat taking people round. There's actually people that live kind of on the water, on barges, and there's a whole community, and there's a whole way. There's now the public use the public space and the public realm much more than ever back in the days when it was dilapidated. So it's been an incredible redevelopment, and Watershed was the first part, really, of that jigsaw of development. So for a long time, it was just those 2 sheds that were there, and we were showing films and events and doing everything that we still do today. But as I say, the process of development of Watershed has taken, and it still is evolving over the 40 years of its existence. But central to it were 2 things, really, 3 things. The first was cinema. I really love this pointer, by the way. The first was cinema has always been central to it. It was we describe it as it was 1.5 screens. That's what we had in the early days. We've now got 3 screens. We were due to build a 4th screen before COVID. We had some money in place to build a 4th screen. COVID happened, and now everything's off. All bets are off. The other important thing was this space here, which is the cafe bar and the social space. So, you know, the cinema, the cafe bar have been absolutely central to the place for 40 years. And then there's, in this part of the building down here, there's flexible spaces. So it's not got raked seating like here, but it's sort of empty space that we've got a screen in all of the rooms actually, but they're flexible and can be shaped into whatever way we want to use it. And we do conference hires. So again, the three things: cinema, cafe bar, and conferencing and events, which was also a really important part of the economy of Watershed. So that's just to give you a sense of, and this is just to give you an example of the programme. This is the programme that we've got on at the moment. That's just happened at the weekend. You know, we've got Killers of the Flower Moon, which is on here. The Ken Loach film, The Old Oak, is still running. Pigeon Tunnels, Errol Morris, it is Errol Morris, isn't it? Documentary on John le Carré. Typist Artist Pirate King is a new film from Carol Morley, British independent filmmaker. And on the Friday, just over here, was Carol came down with to talk about it, introduce the film. James Baldwin here, Cities on Film, is part of a partnership with Bristol Festival of Ideas, and also features as part of Black History Month, about the writer and poet and James Baldwin, black poet and writer, who was a major figure in sort of civil rights and black politics of the 1950s and 60s. Smokes on a Sisterhood's fantastic documentary about women in saunas and the kind of private space that women. So it just gives you the range of the programme. We are not a multiplex. We're not a commercial cinema, and we are there to present. The multiplex and commercial mainstream cinema is taking care of itself. There's plenty of them, although I'll come on to that later on. But there's plenty of them, and what we're about is providing a kind of a different and diverse. As we all know, there's lots of different kinds of cinemas and filmmaking that's happening, and we want to sort of reflect that. I think it's there. So this is the sort of key point, is that, and something that's evolved in my practice over the period that I've been at Watershed, is that when asked about, how do you program the cinema, how do you select the films and stuff like that, is actually, a lot of things that we do is programmed in partnership, and that partnership is with community groups, community activists, a whole range of different people, and I could talk about the range of them, but hopefully you'll get a sense of it. And actually, what I realised is that cinema is, again, this social space. Obviously, we're all quiet when we're watching the film, but it's the before and after part of it, and it's the context that cinema provides. And I've described it as where curation, culture, and communities connect. And so, and here you've got you get the projection, this bum. But anyway, I won't say anything any more about that. But you've got the social space, and you see that people, talking, except this fellow here, who's professor of film at Salford University, and he should, I think he's in a quiz and looking up an answer. But what you see is the social and the connection and the interaction. And the reason I've put this here is a slight provocation, because all these photographs was during our festival, Cinema Rediscovered, from 2 years ago, and it was when we did a hybrid festival. So because we're still coming out of COVID, we did hybrid, and what's happening here is a panel discussion, actually happening live. I'm sat in the cinema at the back of the auditorium with my computer, listening in to this Zoom conversation about curation. Meanwhile, I'm checking an interview that I did with Agnes Godard, who was talking about working with Claire Denis. And so whilst I'm sat in the cinema just checking this, I'm also doing this, which of course is technologically brilliant. it's technologically fantastic to be able to do. But this here, these points here, are for me actually where the kinds of discussions happen that's got more, that have more connections and more longevity, as it were, than the online space. Now, I've put this here to illustrate a set of different elements, which is about a kind of community, but also about the kind of role that Watershed plays in supporting, I guess, supporting talent and talent development in a way. So what's happening up here is, that's Tara. And Tara is in conversation with Mark Jenkins, who's the director of Bait. Have people heard of the film or the director? Yeah. So Mark is, you know, a long-time filmmaker who Tara's a huge fan and advocate of, who's based in the southwest of England, in Cornwall, and has been making work in a very artisanal artist, filmmaker way using film. His film Bait was in the forum section of Berlinale, and you know, in relative terms, and from my professional side, you know, it was a small film, great film, but a small film, and it was produced by two producers, Kate and Lynn, from Bristol, and that's Kate and Lynn here at the Berlin Film Festival. So they came over to the Berlin Film Festival with the film. I was in Berlin because professionally that's what I do. One of the things that we also do, as was mentioned at the introduction, was we run MA postgraduate work in partnership with the University of the West of England. One of the courses that we ran was on independent cinema and independent film. And we took these students, so these are all the students from the course, and we took them out to Berlin in order that they could experience a film market and they could experience the film industry, as it were, happening. And it just so happened at that time that Bait, Mark's film, went through the roof. It got a 5-star review in The Guardian at the festival. It became the buzz title of the festival. So Kate and Lynn, who were there, they were transformed into, we want your film, we want to buy your film, and all this. So I could put them in together with the students to experience what that meant, and you know what those set of relationships were, and actually what was happening at a film festival. I've no idea why I put this photograph in, except that that's Mark taking a photograph of something on stage. So I need to work it out, but I'll come back to you on that. And this here is, yes, I'm there, but this is Natalie, who is, so Bristol got the designation of being a UNESCO City of Film 10 years ago, maybe. I can't remember when, but
No, it's a little bit more recent than that, I think.
Yeah, but time just changes also.
I think it's 5 or 6.
Yeah, and then, so this is still the Berlin Film Festival, and Natalie was out there from the UNESCO City of Film, from Bristol City Council Film Office, to promote Bristol. And she wanted to understand how, you know, the festival worked and how Bristol City could be part of this. And this is Rich, who's Encounters Short Film Festival that runs out of Bristol. And this is Alice Cabanis, who was working on the festival then, but is now gone on to be the head of the British Film Institute's Talent Network, which is a production scheme which is about supporting and developing talent. And, you know, in a way, what struck me about this, which is these are historical photographs from 5 years ago, but it's the sets of relationships and the sets of connections that are going across, you know, undergraduate, postgraduate studies, you know, Watershed supporting and connecting and networking, and also with Mark, you know, we put on Mark's film Bait when it opened. We ended up playing it for 14 or 15 weeks, and we supported the release of the film across not just the Southwest, but also across the UK. And in part of that part of those, the thing about curation and communities is working in partnership with a range of different people that bring different voices into the cinema's programme. I'm called cinema curator, but I actually don't like the word curator. It doesn't seem to. It's that finger. It just doesn't seem to, because there's a bit of a cult of the curator, and it sits more in the art world. And there was about 20 years ago very much a kind of cult of the curator, which I'm not mad on. But in the cinema world, I was keen to distinguish between the intentionality of selecting films, which is curation, whereas the industry side of it talks about programming, which is a very functional and transactional sort of term, programming or scheduling. So the film world is kind of, it's, I mean, we are torn between a business, commercial, and culture. And so we sit, and it's maybe more so in the UK because we share the language with America. We're kind of a subsidiary. You could say that Britain's a subsidiary of Hollywood. And it's about the business of film. But where Watershed sits, and this is something that's, again, struck me through COVID, and I'll come on to, is that we've always been about, and certainly I have in my practice, been about working in partnership with people. And this illustration is for me, is a really powerful illustration of it. So we were screening Steve McQueen's film, 12 Years a Slave. So 12 Years a Slave, the film opened in January, whichever year it was. And because it was quite a big release, it was on in the multiplex, and it was also on at Watershed. And as I said to you before, Bristol was at the epicentre of the slave trade and has had a very troubled, to understate it, relationship with its history of the slave trade. So here we've got a film called 12 Years a Slave, which is about the slave trade, which is playing in Bristol. I had been working with Roger, this is Roger here, as part of a group called, a black programming group called Come the Revolution. And I said to them, look, we've got 12 Years a Slave coming up. We'd like, let's, how do we sort of present it, because it's clearly going to open up, a range of issues. And we set up a series of informal and formal discussions. So, I mean, people could come and see the film and then just leave, didn't have to stay, they could just still come and see the film. But there was also, if you wanted to discuss it, you could, there was times when people would be in the cafe bar, and you could talk to them about it, just share that conversation. And then there was more formal conversations as well. And this one that Roger did, which I think is one of the best things that I've sort of sat in and experienced, which was Roger, clearly black, talking to a sold-out audience of about 200 people, of which the majority were white. I mean, there was very few black people in that particular screening. And Roger introduced the screening and he hadn't watched the film. And he said to them, we're watching this together because I've not seen it. I just, know everything that has, things that have been written about it. And then at the end of it, I'll come back and we'll have a discussion about it. Which was an incredibly brave thing to do for anybody, to put themselves, I've not watched the film and I'm going to talk to you about it, or we're going to have a conversation. So he did, and fortunately we've recorded it, so it's on our website if anybody wants to see it. But what happened there was that, and it was Roger on his own, it wasn't moderated, it was him and it was the audience, and it was a film about slavery. And what happened was an incredible charged atmosphere in the room, because the conversation ended up talking about bullying. And there was two older white women who were maybe in their 70s who had been to public school, which in Britain's private school. So they had been to private school, and they talked about the experience they had of bullying. And Roger and them connected this incredible conversation between Roger on stage, them towards the back of this. And I mean, you could feel the emotion and the tears and, you know, all of this stuff. And it just seemed to me a brilliant sort of illustration of the power of offering the space for reflection, conversation. And it was amplified by, there was a young black woman came to one of the events, and she said afterwards, not to me, I got this secondhand, she said that she'd gone to see 12 Years a Slave in the multiplex in Bristol. And, you know, just think about that for a minute, is, you know, you think about a young black woman going to see this film, and you think about the multiplex experience and what that is. Goes in, buys the ticket, past the popcorn, past the sweets, past the, you know, all of this, past the posters for Marvel or whatever's there, and then goes into the cinema. And then for 2.5 hours is transported to the plantations of the Deep South and Solomon Northup's story. And is sitting watching this, and then exits the cinema, and she just wanted to talk to somebody about what she had just seen. But the multiplex is not geared up for that conversation. It is not a conversation that the commercial mainstream is interested in having. They've got a job to do, and that job is about generating income from you and getting you back out so that the next lot can go back in. And so she said, I just welcome the opportunity to be able to discuss how that felt, watching that film. And for me, just, again, it was just a really kind of great illustration of where these things connect. Oh, I'm confusing myself now. So yeah, just a brief bit about you know, what happened under lockdown and COVID was, I mean, I went through an existential crisis. I don't know if I've ever come out of it, but
Me too.
Yeah, and I mean that existential crisis was that this was closed. The cinema was closed. All cinemas were closed, and it was the first time that I think any cinemas had been, or your cinema infrastructure had been fully closed. But meanwhile, everybody was watching films. So, you know, there's lots of talk of the death of cinema, particularly in the UK and particularly in the Guardian newspaper. But I actually thought, well, maybe this is it, you know, maybe this is the end of cinema, because everybody's watching streaming, everybody's consuming films, but they're not consuming it at our place because they can't get in. However, we pivoted, I think was the expression, we pivoted online, and we did quite a lot of online, and this is just an example of some of the stuff that we pivoted to. I'll just to get my notes. Yeah, this over here was an online short film competition, Short It Out, that we ran whilst we were closed with the British Film Institute. You know, we did a whole short filmmaking. We posted it online. Over here is Edson is also one part of Come the Revolution in Bristol, and this is him in conversation with Aki. I've got to get Aki's surname absolutely right. Aki Omoshabi, who's had made his first debut feature film called Real, which was set in Portsmouth, which is south of London. It's a really wonderful, delicate love story. So it was really, and you know, we managed to get him in conversation with Edson online, and we pushed it out through our social media channels, which was great in order to be able to offer audiences at least still some engagement with Watershed. This was, we run a strand called Conversations About Cinema with the University Philosophy Department, which uses new films that are coming up, and we have a discussion in partnership with the Philosophy Department. They bring speakers, they bring students, we provide the film, the space for the discussion, and we wanted to continue doing that whilst we were closed. And we did it actually in partnership with Mubi, the online streaming platform, curated online streaming platform. And it worked, in the sense that, we had films audiences were watching films. What was really interesting was that we had a global audience, which I thought was really... So when we did the online Q&As, we were actually getting people from... We had people from Trinidad, we had people from Italy, we had people from all over the world that were able to connect. And that's what I thought was the kind of upside of this kind of online hybrid space. However, just to continue this idea of the cinema as a co-curated space, these lovely people are the MA curation students. So every year we partner with the university on a curation course where we take a placement from the curation course, and that placement learns about Watershed, the background to it, the business model, the cultural model, the curation, etc., etc. And as part of what they do is the final project is they deliver a curated film season. So the one this year is by Lorena Pino, who is a Venezuelan emigre based in just outside Bristol, and Lorena has put together a season of Latin American films directed by women filmmakers, which is a kind of wonderful selection. And these are some of the other students who have had years at Watershed, and I'm using them because what they are different voices that are coming into Watershed's programme. And as I say, this year it's Lorena that's doing it. As part of that, 5 minutes. Sorry. As part of that curation, and what we do at the cinema is we obviously show new films that you saw in the programme outline, but also we show older films in repertory cinema. One of the things that experiences for me was, before everything, was seeing younger audiences come to see repertory films. So we would put on Sergio Leone films, we'd put on Kurosawa films, and they would always get fantastic audiences, but younger audiences coming to see them. I would go to Bologna, Il Cinema Ritrovato, when we were part of Europe, for training courses. And I would go to that festival and just see the engagement with the history of cinema. And I'll tell the story. Sorry, Koen, if you've heard it, Tara. But one year I was there, there was a restoration of John Ford's not Young Mr. Lincoln, My Darling Clementine. And it was a restoration. It was a cinema with 500 people. It was packed, a lot of young people. The late, great Peter von Bach introduced the film, who was the director of the festival, and he simply said, "This is the greatest American film ever made." And then he exited. And as the house lights came down, I thought to myself, it's not even John Ford's greatest film. What the hell's he on about? But by the end of it, sitting in that auditorium, experiencing that film, kind of like for the first time, I hadn't seen it in the cinema. I realised I'd only seen it on television. But what I realised was I came out of it thinking, actually, you might be right. It might be the greatest American film. And so what had happened at that moment was the history of American cinema was being rewritten or rethought. I was rethinking everything. I was thinking that maybe it is the best John Ford film. How do you define a great American? What is a great American film? So a range of experiences like that. But also going back to the collaboration, the communities, there's a brilliant group of cinephiles, cine activists, people like Tara, Southwest Silence. There's a great community of film people in Bristol, and I kind of wanted to set up something like Il Cinema Ritrovato, set it up as Cinema Rediscovered with this group of people that I knew would be had knowledge and experience to bring to it. But it was also about engaging the audiences with the history of cinema. And my line would be, was that the past is cinema's future. On that. Yeah. This, again, is illustration of the cinema as a talent development. I mentioned some of the talent development side. I mean, we do... There's a lot more to talk about in terms of we are now running some of the BFI network, and talent development is a really important part of what we do. As is, this is a kind of talent development programming overlap with a group called Cables and Cameras, which is a very activist group of promoting new films by people of colour. And Adam up here is part of that. He's gone on to set up Bristol Black Film Club, which we are sort of partnering with Adam on doing. So again, just a kind of illustration of the layers and relationships across. Now, yes, this finally comes on to... so I think I'd said under COVID, existential crisis. Post-COVID, to hell with the online, to hell with hybridity. It's about the cinema, and it's about people coming together. And what I realised as well was there was actually a very clear distinction for me between the work of the commercial mainstream multiplex and the work of a venue like Watershed. And it became much more focused post-COVID. I mean, we can talk much more about that and what it means, its implications. But what we've had post-COVID is still an economic flush through really sort of serious economic environment, particularly in the UK. Probably Brexit contributed to it. But we've got quite a severe economic problem, and cinema is having a hard time. And up here is, this is a Cineworld multiplex in Bristol. When I started in Bristol, there were no multiplexes. Then there was 4 multiplexes. Now there'll be 3 multiplexes because this one's closing. It's part of the Cineworld chain that filed for bankruptcy in America. This is an independent in Edinburgh, which sadly closed, Filmhouse. And it was the canary in the mine. And I think there's still a long way to go in terms of the financial health of cinemas. But central to our survival and our thriving is that we recognise our place as this intersection of culture and communities and collaboration. Shall I leave it there?
Yeah, I think so that we have a little bit of time to discuss before we open it up. Thank you, Mark. That's great. There's lots of things there that you talked about that I'd like to pick up on. But I will just start by saying I think it was interesting that you spoke about the term curator and sort of not necessarily feeling at home with that description. And it's probably worth pointing out that before the pandemic, I was working at Watershed with Mark, and my role was cinema producer, and I was never very comfortable with the term producer, because I always thought that the role was about creating conversations. But I guess that's in essence what somebody decided the word producer meant in that context. And that my role, along with many others, was something that was there until, with this plan for a 4th screen, with the trajectory the cinema was on. And I'm sure you don't mind me saying that, you know, I was full-time before the pandemic, but I happened to be on maternity leave when it hit. And then when I came back from the pandemic, there was a reshuffle. There were lots of people made redundant. My role was quite severely reduced to a part-time role, which was in theory fine, but then sort of turned out to be trying to do a full-time job in a part-time hours and didn't quite fit. And I think that in terms of the existential crisis, I just want to say that I think that it's very interesting to kind of think about it in a city that is also has the kind of deep roots to slavery and all the other things that you mentioned, is that we actually have tried to kind of recover from COVID, I think, in a way where, and very much I think this is the attitude of empire, this is echoes of the kind of British thinking, is that you can recover from something without dealing with it. And so I think that we're on this trajectory at the moment where people are trying to recover from a crisis, and we're entering continued other crises. cost of living crises, resource crises, climate crises, the war in Ukraine, the war in Gaza, all of these things that are going on. We're kind of sitting in several traumas, but without addressing any of them, hoping to begin the process of recovery. And I think this very much is at the heart of why cinemas are somewhere that are about culture and community, because they are a place for conversation, because they are somewhere where, not to sound too sort of unicorns and rainbows, but they are a site where healing can begin. And healing can only begin because you can critically engage with things, because you can talk openly, like you've spoken about with the kind of history of events and things that you've brought together, is that it is about people making those connections. It is about people starting things up, whether that's film clubs, whether that's filmmakers, whether that's people making the connections for different things in their own personal, but like you said with 12 Years a Slave, somebody at the back of the room, dealing with bullying for the first time. We've seen it countless times in Q&A rooms. The film that was about the Jehovah's Witnesses, what was that called? British film.
I know,
Just temporarily forgotten the title. It'll come to me later. But loads of Jehovah's Witnesses, or ex-Jehovah's Witnesses especially, live in Bristol, and that was a really cathartic experience for people to talk about their experience of being in and then out of that church. That people come to these screenings not just to see films, and that it is about so much more in terms of how we show respect for each other as human beings, how we have a two-way conversation and humanity. And I think that encounter with humanity is something that is quite deeply absent from the kind of online viewing experience. And the reason for that is because all of the things that you can create online, all of the ways in which we try to kind of put those things together, and it's worth saying that after I didn't continue in the middle of the pandemic working for Watershed, I worked part-time for Mubi editing critics' reviews, which is an online streaming platform. But all of that stuff that's put together online to create that sense of community cannot have the same connection, cannot have that same sort of dealing with deep issues and deep trauma and helping people to actually recover and go beyond recovery, precisely because it's not physical and it doesn't hold a space. And we kind of know that, like, in other spheres, in terms of psychology and the way in which people process trauma and deal with things, that the physical space is incredibly instrumental in how we address that. And so, other things that, particularly traumatic time in Bristol, I think, as well. In the middle of the pandemic, it's also worth talking about the fact that there was a statue of Edward Colson in the city centre, which, he was a leading figure that was involved in the slave trade, and that was part of the BLM, the Black Lives Matter protests and movements. That statue was torn down, it was graffitied, it was thrown into the river. They've dredged it up, they've kind of put it into one of the museums in Bristol to work out what they're going to do with that artifact. But that there is this trauma that has to be dealt with, and that has to be dealt with tangibly, physically, and in person and in place. I think you can't do that through the interface of a screen, even though what we're doing is watching films and interfacing with the screen as a starting point. But that cinema is a starting point. It's not the end point. We don't watch the film and then that's the end of it. And I think what you said about the multiplex was also deeply important, and particularly struck me the image of somebody going to see 12 Years a Slave, walking past, as you said, the sweets. Sugar was the main trade, slave trade that Bristol was involved in. So, we have these echoes and these reminders. They are everywhere. There is no possibility of walking into an auditorium and leaving that all behind. You can't sit in your home and not hold that too. So how do you deal with that? And how do we deal with, when we talk about cultural recovery and we talk about kind of curating films for people, we're not really just curating films, we're curating spaces. You're in the business of a venue, you're in the business of curating a space, really. You're in the business of holding and creating somewhere that all of these people with all of these different experiences can come, and somehow we can find ways to start with that puzzle of healing. So that's my sort of response overall to the things you said. There was lots in what you said, so there's lots to pick up on. But maybe if you want to respond to what you think about that before we open up to the audience, because we will have a little bit of time for everyone else to discuss.
It's about, you're right, it's about responsibility of place. And so if I came here if I was lucky enough to come here and programme the cinema here, I wouldn't be able to give it the depth of engagement without feeling or knowing the city. When I remember, maybe 15 years ago or so, when Watershed was really, we were sort of really beginning to grow and beginning to really assert a vision, as it were, or ourselves, and people would come and experience it, and they'd say, "Oh, could we have a Watershed in our city?" I mean, we were actually asked by somebody if we could set up a Watershed in London and set up a Watershed in Barcelona, and it's just like, it's nice to be talked about in that way, but you just think, well, no, because we're of Bristol. I mean, we're very. It's about us in this place, and it's about our relationship and responsibility to that relationship. Now, I'm not from Bristol. I'm from Scotland, from Glasgow, but it did take me. I had the arrogance of youth, but it did take me a good 10 years, I think, to really feel that I'd begun to understand a bit more about Bristol, and that you realise as part of that it is working in partnership. So when we do festivals and events, we're inviting people in, and it's not us saying do this, do that. It's us inviting people in, and we have those conversations before the event. Is how it's constructed, what it's about, what we're trying to achieve, etc., etc. And then, but it's about those voices being foregrounded as part of it, and it has been responsible and sensitive to that as well, and so it is very much about the sense of the specificity of place in the city or the town or the village, wherever it is that you are. Whereas the commercial model is obviously just a completely different commercial model. Whether it's the everyman chain, the cousin chain, or the showcase, etc. They are about a commercial exploitation. Whereas I guess we're about a cultural exploitation, if you sort of view it in that way.
Yeah, although I guess the ultimate question that kind of repeatedly comes up, because you make the case with film house closing, is that there is still eternally the issue of commerce, and the essential problem that independent cinema, cultural cinema, is not entirely sustainable on its own. That there, and this is why Watershed is a model that works and survives, because it is a charity, it has an arts trust, and it has a commercial trading arm.
Yeah.
So it has two separate parts to the business. That structure helps support what it is. That conferencing, that hire of the space, those events, those things support the financial structure. There is also a funding model, albeit a complex and not necessarily perfect one, but there is Arts Council and British Film Institute funding that support that model. There's also, independent philanthropy. There's sort of benefactors who support and help the cinema. What is going to be, and this is not that I think you have the answer, but what is the kind of, what can we do when, we sort of, I guess, feel that these spaces are vital? We are in several crises, amidst several crises. We are losing cinemas. I think that aside from, France definitely is one of the very few countries that hasn't had a single cinema close over the pandemic, but that is primarily because the CNC fund it so well. So it's so well supported by the government, by the different institutions in France. They made sure that their cinemas didn't close. At the last Europa Cinemas conference, they even said that they are considering, at that time they were considering putting together a support package for the cost of living and electricity and, you know, resource crises, so that they could help the cinemas through the winter, which will be the difficult part of paying your bills. So, you know, we have an example of a model where that is the case. But what to those of us in other countries where that model is not the same, where maybe we don't have the same kind of central pots of funding, what can we do to sustain independent cinema where the financial model alone is just not enough? You don't have to necessarily have an answer to that, but that's how I'd sort of like to kind of maybe start opening up to the room, is like if you have specific questions either from Mark's presentation or the things we've discussed, or, you know, what your experiences or thoughts are for the kind of future model or the sustaining model of independent cinema.
I mean, what I would just add is that it's tough. I think we're certainly experiencing it in the UK, where I think I've said to Cohn that next financial year is going to be, for me, is going to be a crunch point. And I think that, unfortunately, there will be other closures. I fear. And I think there will be I mean, you know, it's like a shakedown of the, you know, the system. And whilst we do, because we can, you know, I know that you cannot live by cinema alone. And so we do have a trading company, we have a lot of different, but, you know, we need money to do the roof. We need money to buy new digital projectors. We need money to upgrade you know, all of these things that are really boring, but are really fundamental. Yeah. And so there needs to be a longer term strategy. I think specifically, because we're in the public sector, I would call on the BFI, who did an investment strategy, cultural strategy during COVID, and published a 10-year plan. What I would say, and this is a UK issue, but what I would say is, you know, that was written under those circumstances. The world has changed. The landscape has changed. And actually, you need to go back and rewrite it, given what we know now about certainly about the exhibition sector. And if you want a strong, healthy, independent film culture, cinema culture, then you're going to have to sort of relook at how that's underpinned. So I do think each venue, you know, wants to make itself run efficiently and effectively. But I think the old model that we lived up to through to 2020, whenever it was, the great year of Parasite and Bait and everything, when all the growth trajectory was heading up. Yeah. That's why we were building a fourth screen. Yeah. And now it's like, oh, there's a whole different. So it just needs to be looked at in a much more holistic way, in a fresh eye, which says, you know, first of all, are these things important? Is film culture, cinema going, independent film culture important? If it is important, we value it, then how do we sustain it? And it needs to be a kind of shared discussion. But I think the key thing is, and I don't know if it's the same here, and I know it's in different parts of Europe, but the key thing is that cinema exhibition is yes, there's a commercial mainstream side, but there's another this other model. The one last thing I would just say, just as it's been going through my mind, is that if people know the term the cinema value chain, then the value chain is of course ideas, films get made, produced, films get sold into market, so distribution. You know, films go out to cinemas, distribution, and then at the end of it, it's always the end is exhibition. So, and what is exhibition? Well, film exhibition is about recouping the money for the production. That's what it's about, really. And so the beginning of the value chain under this model is the production. This production. And what I'm arguing and trying to say is that no. It's the very beginning, is cinema. The exhibition is not at the end, it's actually at the beginning. Because it's where people, if you talk to any director worth their salt, it's because I saw a film in the cinema that change their, and
Well, it's where the film actually happens.
and it's where the engagement, and so there needs to be a kind of rethinking of the role of cinema like this as being right at the beginning of everything. And of course, when I say that, people say, well, you would say that, Mark, wouldn't you? You know what I mean? And it's just like, well, it's evidently true.
Yes, but in a way it also echoes the kind of the crux of the issue with the way in which the engagement from the funding models work. We were discussing this briefly before, but there are funding models like Europa Cinemas, for example, in Europe, that do that, in that they discuss with representatives from cinemas what would be the best ways to use funds. They have focus groups, they kind of look at, how this money can be used, what is needed among network cinemas, how would this help, what would be useful, and they get that feedback before they go off and do it. Whereas in the UK, for example, the British Film Institute model is that the BFI decide what the money should be used for, and they tell the cinemas. There is not a kind of there's no reverse engineering in the, and then it is how everything in the UK is done. It is kind of an echo of empire. It is, we know what's best, we will tell you, we will do it to you, and you will get on with what we've kind of given. Whereas, and it's the same with, if you think about how does the cinema make connections and culture and community, well, the cinema doesn't go, we want your community to come to our cinema, we're going to bring you here and plonk you in. The cinema says, what would you like to do in the cinema? What can we do with you? And then the community groups, create and engage. Like, for example, Cinema Rediscovered is a good example. When you started that up in 2016, I was working in the video shop that still exists in Bristol, because we're that kind of a city. And the video store and Southwest Silence and all these other people, we weren't working in cinema exhibition, we were just working in the city film lovers. But you didn't tell us, we're going to do Cinema Rediscovered, you have to do this. You said, what would you like to do? And we came in and said, different people said they wanted to do different things. I wanted to run a film critics workshop. You and Maddie said, okay, Tare, you can run a film critics workshop, So it's about also that kind of, that how you understand the engagement process, and how you understand which direction that goes in. And I think that comes back to the very essence of what you said at the very beginning, which is why the kind of existential crisis, why cinema didn't work so well in the pandemic and it does work so well on site, is that it is a two-way conversation. It is not just the film speaks to the audience and that's the end and then the lights come up and you can leave if you want to, that's fine. But I think increasingly we know that the thing that actually gets audiences in cinemas is Q&As, discussions, these sorts of events where it's not just people here talking there. And I guess with that in mind, we've done a lot of talking. So now it is time to make that two-way thing start to happen. So is there anyone who has something they'd like to say or a question? It could be either a comment or a question, we don't mind, but we'd like to invite you to participate as well, if you would like to, of course.
Hello, great presentation, thank you. My name is Igor, I'm also curator/programmer at the Slovenian Cinematheque, also running a festival beside that. I just have a specific one. Are you exclusively working with distributors? Because let's say in the UK, probably there are many. In Slovenia, we have only 5 distributors, 6 maybe, cool. Or in the case as it's with the Rediscovered series or festival, are you acting also as a limited distributor yourself? And in this case, would you screen the film only in this 1 week, or would you take it for a month for a few times? So
that's a good point, good question, because it was something I meant to say about Cinema Rediscovered. So there are, I lose track of how many distributors there are in the UK. There are a lot of, there's the major distributors, and then there are the major minor distributors, and then there are a lot of smaller distributors. I don't know if it's the same here, but in any given week in the UK, there's about 15 films released into the market. So it's a kind of huge saturated market as well, and there's a kind of real broad range. and there's a lot of distributors, and so there's therefore a lot of on the kind of week by week programming. You know, we've only got 3 screens, and it's difficult trying to make films work in the theatrical market that require that if they don't come with all the publicity and all the Barbie campaign, if they're a kind of smaller independent film, it's very difficult to allow them to breathe actually in the marketplace, and so we're looking at that. I mean, there's some good examples. Past Lives is a good current example where we've actually played that for about 8 weeks, very sort of thinly through the schedule, and because of the financial terms, it may well end up making us more money than Barbie did. But yeah, so that's a kind of ongoing sort of not dilemma, but interesting space. But with Cinema Rediscovered, yes, what we've found ourselves doing is actually being a kind of distributor by default. It's great. We wanted the festival. It happens in July, the end of July, and because the market in August in the summer in the UK is not brilliant for independent cinema, independent film, then what we wanted to, was keen to do was make Cinema Rediscovered a kind of platform for restorations going into the wider theatrical market. And so we tour some of the films, some of the programme seasons. We toured the season that I mentioned. I think I mentioned it was mentioned in the introduction. When Europe went to Hollywood, we toured those films to about 20 cinemas across the UK and Ireland. And then this year we've toured individual titles as well as the season. But that's also, I mean, whilst what I talked about was focusing on Bristol partnerships and that communities and partnerships, our partnerships are also with independent cinemas across the UK, and so I know my equivalent that works in different cities, and I can, because I've been around long enough, I can quite easily sort of say, look, are you interested? And we can talk about that, and so then that opens up the UK as a kind of interesting market, if you think of it in that way, for some of the restorations and archive films, which I think is a really good, because everybody is finding that younger audiences, and when I say younger, I mean under 25, the younger audiences have got a real appetite for seeing, restorations and the kind of history of cinema.
It's also worth saying, to that point, just that when Watershed or Cinema Rediscovered does the touring programme, they don't then take the distribution money from the other cinemas. They more kind of act as a conduit with the distributor.
That's why we're not really a distributor.
They're not really a distributor in that they don't take the money from it. They work in partnership with the cinemas. Yeah. And part of that is things like when we did Infirme Douce, which didn't have a UK release at all, and we convinced after a lot of work, I convinced Park Circus that it was worth distributing it. And I had to prove that I could get the cinemas on board first, but part of that also is getting the distributor to agree to make the cost of showing the film less. So we didn't take any money for it. In fact, it cost us a bit of money to do it. Yeah. But we managed to, on the back of that kind of lobbying, I guess it's more of a lobbying position in a way than distribution, get them to distribute the film with all of the stuff that we did to support it at a lower rate for the other cinemas.
But it's not only Park Circus that you would work with.
No, it's other cinemas too, but Park Circus is...
distributors.
Other distributors too, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I think we're going to talk a bit more about this Cinema Rediscovered, because you said something interesting in your talk, that actually the past cinema is the future of the cinema. So maybe if you could elaborate a little about what you think with that and why you think that is important.
Yeah. I sometimes come up with quite aphoristic sayings, which registers with people that I'm trying to convince that showing. So, but I do believe it. My other phrase is that I meant to say it is that multiplexes are in the culture of business. We are in the business of culture. You've got both the same words, they're just round a different way. That's another one that I put out there. But no, it was really it was that experience in Bologna, and it was the experience of seeing My Darling Clementine in that context, and that film came alive in a very present way that spoke to you know, as Peter von Bach was saying, is it actually spoke to what he I think was talking about was about a value system within America and within American culture. It would be interesting to put it against Killers of the Flower Moon, for example, you know, and have that whole debate. But what it was that it was the ability of the festival to make those films, that film at that moment in time, seemed to speak to now. And so its power had certainly not diminished or gone away. And it's about context then, it's about how you frame the film and how you invite the audience in for the conversation. In the film world, it's all about the next thing. It's all about the next big thing, you know. So we've all forgotten Barbie, and we're probably all thinking about Barbie 2 or Barbie 3D, or, you know, that's the way the machine works. And I'm sort of more interested in the reflection back and then forward, you know. So it is that sort of, and also you know, the other art forms have got their histories and have got the places of the presentation of their histories. So nobody bats an eyelid when there's a retrospective of whoever, you know, at the Tate Modern or the Tate Britain or whatever. Nobody, you know, that's what should happen. You know, is that you should have classical music. You know, Mahler should still be performed. You know, these things. It's just taken, but somehow when you show a silent film, it's like, oh, it's an old thing, isn't it? You know, it's just, you know. And so there's a kind of perception that that's the case. And as I say, for me, the experience of both being in Bologna and seeing it come alive, really in a way that is still just quite incredible. That this, you know, these films that were made all that time. I'm going to watch the Victor Arithi film tonight, and you know, I'm really looking forward to it. But it's that ability of when it's on there and it's with an audience there, that it comes alive again. I mean, if I wanted to get sort of maybe theoretical, whatever, one, you know, an important framing for me was the critic George Steiner. I don't know if people have read George Steiner, but his book Real Presence. He's a bit. You start a sentence and you're just going, oh, where did that all go? But what he talks about in Real Presence is that you know, we could open the computer and we could all look at a Vermeer painting, and we could all say that we've seen that Vermeer painting. But it's of a different order than if you go to where the Vermeer painting is and you stand in front of it. And he talks about, and I think it's something that Walter Benjamin talks about as well, which is the art object and the thing itself. And there is a different relationship that happens if you are in proximity to that thing. Now, the problem with film, the existential problem with film, is it's reproducible. So are you seeing the original Victor Arithi's Spirit of the Beehive? Well, you have to say that, I hope it's a good print, by the way. DCP, it's a DCP, so it's slightly different, okay. But what we are seeing it in is, we're watching it in the conditions that it was made for. That Victor Arithi made this film to be seen in a cinema. And John Ford had made My Darling Clementine to be seen in the cinema. And I've seen it on television, but seeing it in the cinema, in that experience, there was a different order of engagement with it. And I think that is, that's a kind of, there's something happens, and I've experienced it happen watching audiences, being with audiences, watching films. I think we all have. And I'm really interested in that, but also that younger audiences who are saturated with the possibilities of, watching and, et cetera, actually they recognise that there is something that is happening within the cinema presentation. And I'll give you an example of it, which is the Edward Yang's film, Yi Yi, which was made in the year 2000 and kind of disappeared, and it's not been available. And we managed to get a print of it free of charge, I have to say, through a partnership that we had, and we screened this lost Taiwanese film. And I put it in one of our smaller screens, because I thought we'd probably get about 60 people. And then we had to move it into the bigger screen, and we ended up getting 180 people. And the vast majority of those were younger audiences, because we've got an under 25 ticket. And the majority of the audience were under 25. And I just thought, how did that happen? This was only about a year ago. And I've got a young person working with me, who's now sort of looking after the programming of the cinema. And I said, how did this, how do we think this happened, And she showed me Letterboxd. Does anybody use Letterboxd? Yeah. She showed me Letterboxd, and which is a great community. It's much better. I've got to be careful, Call Needham, but it's much better. I think it's much better than that. Don't quote me on this. Sorry, Call. That's the guy who founded IMDb. He lives in Bristol. He's a good friend. But Letterboxd is much more community based in terms of enthusiasm, cinema and stuff. In terms of it's much more cineast or whatever. I don't know. But she showed me this list, and it's full of lists and all these interesting. She showed me this list, and it said, 25 films you should see before you're 25, type thing, And there was Taxi Driver, there was The Godfather, and there was Yi Yi was in there. Now I would never have known that, because I'm now got Letterboxd, and I try and keep up with the whole thing. But so there's a much more informed and there's a much more informed dialogue going on amongst young people. Under 25, say that, under 30s, which is brilliant. And I think they want to experience the kind of, call it the real presence, if you will, call it the authentic, whatever you want, but they want to experience that with film, and that experience is in the cinema.
It's a couple of things there that I just want to pick up on. One is about the role of cultural cinemas doing more retrospective programming, which definitely in the UK is the case. I think that not just Watershed, but lots of other cinemas are expanding the retrospective content in their programming. And I think part of that is to do also with the fact that in the UK, at least, because we have a centralised kind of model where the only thing like a cinematheque ever has been the BFI in London. So the regions have never had that. There's been a real dearth of retrospective programming there. So the independent cinemas have now, I think, realised it's both an opportunity but also taken it upon themselves to kind of fill that gap. We have lots of film culture in Bristol. We don't have a cinematheque. When I lived in Melbourne, I had access to lots of really amazing films precisely because there's a cinematheque. I think anyone who lives in a city with a cinematheque knows the value of that kind of introduction to film history. But also, what was the last thing you said, Mark? I was just going to pick up on. I've forgotten already too because I went back to my first point. Sorry.
Yes, young people, Letterboxd. Young people wanting to.
Yeah. No, it's disappeared.
Yeah.
It'll come back to me. Also, I've just remembered the title of the film about Jehovah's Witnesses. It's Apostasy. Sorry.
Apostasy,
These things
yeah.
return. Sorry, but we'll take another question or comment if anyone else would like to join in. So, did you have a question?
Okay, then I'll join. So you talked about the cinema being a place of conversation. And since we cannot talk about a certain movie before the screening and during the screening, I guess you talked with, we have to talk about it after the screening. So how does Watershed basically do this, engage the audience physically, directly after the screening? Is a cafe on the way out of the screening room enough, or do you just leave people to hang around and talk to each other 2 hours after the screening don't shoo them away?
Yeah, it's some of it is. I would want it to happen all the time, and I would, if it was possible, I would have films, every single screening introduced, just even if it was somebody to say, this is the greatest American film ever made, and then that, it's a kind of provocation, but also you've got to be aware that some people just want to go to the cinema and watch a film and then go. So if you did everything, you'd end up being really annoying. So you try and do where you can. And so the partnership with the philosophy department is brilliant, because it's like taking a public screening of, say, Killers of the Flower Moon. And for this, it's going to be on this day, maybe once every month. And that if you go to that screening, again, you don't have to stay if you don't want to, but it will be introduced by a philosopher who will say something to make and then you can stay at the end and have that, engage in that conversation, and they will get specialists in the area that they want to sort of explore. But what happens with that as well is that post the screening, people go into the cafe bar. Now we as I said, we've got a really great social space. It's probably the most important space, because it is actually because, as you say quite rightly, when the film's on, nobody's talking to each other, and before the film, well, what is there to discuss? But it is in the cafe bar, and we do deaf conversations about cinema actually as well, which is we have, because there's quite a number of deaf members of the audience, and we facilitate that in the cafe bar after the screening. And so it's doing it where we can to make a difference. It's not that it happens all the time, but what you want to feel is actually we do the messages, people's thoughts immediately after the film. So like you've got out here, which is a great idea, by the way. It's so people write their comments and put them up on the notice board. And as that's happening, people are looking over the shoulder. So you've come out the film and people are writing what they thought and sticking up. And people are sort of, can be looking over the shoulder. And then that's just because I stand around a lot and watch people. But, then what will happen is somebody will say, oh, is that what you thought? And yeah, no, I really like that. And then this conversation happens. But we've provided the space, which is the notice board. And it's again, if you think about, the multiplex model, it doesn't want that conversation. It's not geared up for that conversation. It does not want that conversation. It hasn't thought about that conversation. But, I think audiences, and increasingly, given the nature of the world, I think people want to engage in that, and film is a great route through which those kinds of conversations can take place. And so that when people walk into the building, and if you think about Kinodvor, when you walk into the building is, I don't want to get too conceptual about it, but the building is communicating to you something. What is that something, And we used to think about it, because the building's just a building at the end of the day. It's just a building. Some architect will hit me now.
I was going to say, only it isn't.
But
some buildings are designed specific ways to make certain things
exactly.
happen.
But the thing
sure.
is that when you come into the building, how does it feel, and how does it make you feel, and we used to my old boss and I would sit and think about this, and one of the things that we felt we wanted to try and have was that when you walked into Watershed, you felt that something was possible, that there was some possibility of something happening that might change the world. Who knew? But that there was a transformation, that there was something that was. By the building communicated that when you came in, and how that was communicated was through, the staff were engaging with you, and the staff were, talking, and that when you bought a drink, there was, So at the bar, I hear people saying, "Oh, have you just? Here's your drink. Have you just been to see that film? Well, what did you think of it? Oh, we've got this coming up next." So there's a conversation that's going on around the culture.
I think also this is interesting in terms of the online space, and this reminded me of what I did want to say earlier, is that we talked a little bit about that kind of message board type thing, and we've brought it up with also the conversation cards, is that, a lot of the websites that started those closed them down. So while you say that Letterboxd does it a lot better, that kind of sense of community, it's like, well, IMDb used to have message boards, but they shut that down. Mubi used to have community message boards, but they closed that section. And I think it's interesting that we're kind of increasing, while Letterboxd is currently doing it, I'd be interested to see for how long, other models of online spaces are kind of cutting that conversation. Social media is evolving more into literal reels of broadcast rather than communication. I mean, I don't know what X even is anymore, but it's like algorithmically not a platform for conversation anymore. Neither is Facebook, hasn't been for a long time. Instagram and TikTok are really mostly interested in broadcast one way. So these sorts of things are kind of changing. That kind of conversational model, I think, is also kind of shifting. And then you have these spaces that, are and can be about conversation. One of the events from Watershed that I hosted when I worked there that really sticks in my mind is when we had Tanya Horek, who's an academic. Her expertise is around violence in cinema and gendered cinema. And we had the film Revenge. It's a contemporary rape revenge film. And literally in the conversation that we had about the history of rape revenge cinema, and we had a conversation together and then we opened to the audience, I watched as one or two audience members actually over the course of the conversations that we had changed their opinion on whether or not women who dress promiscuously deserve to be victims of a sexual assault. And to witness that change of opinion in a room through the understanding of well-articulated discussions in a safe space that mean that people who have opinions that potentially are quite provocative or fiery or offensive or difficult to manage do not have to be one-way things where you just say what you believe and you are steadfast in your position and you cannot be moved because you have broadcast it. You can have the potential to have what you've said be challenged in a safe space and in a way that is not vilifying, so that it is possible to potentially imagine that things could change. I think we are exactly out of time. I always run exactly to time. But if you did want to add things or discuss or ask more, we will be around both now and
be in the cafe bar.
Will be in the cafe bar. But also we are also around for a couple of days after this. So you can find us and speak with us if you would like to. Thank you, Mark, very much for your presentation and for joining me for conversation. And thank you to Kinodvor and Ikran for hosting us.